How are the priests and Levites provided for by God? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Deuteronomy on Walking Through the Bible.
Of his word, the glory of his cross.
If you have a Bible with you, turn to Deuteronomy chapter 18. We're going to be reading from verses 1 to 8. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Deuteronomy 18, beginning at verse 1. The priests, the Levites, all the tribe of Levi, shall have no part nor inheritance with Israel. They shall eat the offerings of the Lord made by fire and his portion. Therefore, they shall have no inheritance among their brethren. The Lord is their inheritance, as he said to them. And this shall be the priest's due from the people. From those who offer a sacrifice, whether it is a bull or sheep, they shall give to the priest the shoulder, the cheeks, and the stomach. The first fruits of your grain, and your new wine, and your oil, and the first of the fleece of your sheep you shall give him. For the Lord your God has chosen him out of all your tribes to stand to minister in the name of the Lord, him and his sons forever. So if a Levite comes from any one of your gates, from where he dwells among all Israel, and comes with all the desire of his mind to the place which the Lord chooses, then he may serve in the name of the Lord his God, as all his brethren the Levites do, who stand there before the Lord. They shall have equal portions to eat, besides what comes from the sale of his inheritance. In the last chapter, we have been dealing with the behavior of judges, the establishment of the Supreme Court for those cases that local judges couldn't settle, and the behavior of the king when Israel chose to have such. Coming out of chapter 18, we have God turn from judges and kings to his ministers, the priests. In verse 1, note the language used by Moses, the priests, the Levites, all the tribe of Levi. These instructions then refer to the whole tribe of Levi, not simply the priests, unless otherwise indicated. The reason these instructions were necessary was again because the Levites had no land inheritance in Israel, and thus no means on their own of building wealth and providing for themselves. If God had left these instructions out, it might have become very easy, as the children of Israel settled in Canaan, with the tabernacle perhaps many kilometers away, to forget the Levites and not provide for them. The attitude might have cropped up that the Levites weren't pulling their own weight and thus didn't deserve to eat, or that it wasn't fair that families had to give up a portion of what they had earned. Thus God had to remind Israel that the Levites were performing work, but it was the Lord's work. And since God was the one who was blessing the regular Israelite, then God's people could provide for God's ministers. When the people came to offer sacrifices to the Lord, on top of the parts of the sacrifices that were already the priests according to Leviticus, God said that the priest was entitled to the shoulder, cheeks, and stomach of the bull or sheep offered. This probably meant that the sacrifice was a peace offering, as the meat of the burnt offering was completely burned on the altar, and the sin sacrifice had its own regulations concerning the priest as well. The parts of the animal chosen by God for the priests were some of the choicest parts of the animal, showing us God's benevolence for his ministers. They were also to receive of the first fruits of the grain, the new wine and the new oil, as well as the first of the fleece of the sheep. Through this, all the needs of the priests and Levites would be met, as is outlined further in Numbers 18. Now all of these provisions, which went above and beyond the meat sacrifices that already were outlined in Leviticus, might get some to ask, why did God ask even more of Israel? Why wasn't the meat from the sacrifices enough? There are two things to consider on this point. One, right now we had the families of Eleazar and Ithamar. At this point, these families, I'm sure, were growing, but they certainly wouldn't have numbered in the hundreds yet. But as Israel settled in the land, the number of priests will grow, as is evident when in David's day he set forth a schedule for the priests to work in the temple, a schedule that was still in use in Jesus' day as seen in Luke chapter 1. So with the priests' families growing, the portions required needed to feed them, needed to grow too. The second reason, though, has to do with what we read in Deuteronomy 12. If you recall, it is in this chapter that God repealed some of the instructions concerning offering all meats that could be sacrificed on the altar as peace offerings at the door of the tabernacle, instead allowing Israel to kill animals within their gates and eat them there if they weren't to be sacrificed. Israel thus only had to bring meats to the tabernacle that they were actually going to offer to God, whether it was peace offerings, burnt offerings, sin offerings, etc. This repeal thus would greatly reduce the number of animals that would actually be burnt on the altar on any given day, which in turn could have the effect of reducing the priest's daily food supply. That is why God is constantly telling Israel, don't forget the Levite. So in telling Israel to give a greater portion of their sacrifices to the priest, God is ensuring that even though he was accommodating Israel by allowing meats to be killed and eaten within their gates, he was not forgetting the priest or the Levite either. But of course, not all Levites were priests. They might have had other duties, but they wouldn't all be offering sacrifices and thus were not automatically entitled to the sacrificial meats. They were taken care of by the tithes in Numbers 18 and would normally live in the cities that God had chosen for them in Numbers 35. What though if a Levite, out of a love for God, decided that he wanted to minister in the tabernacle, though not as priest, and thus sold whatever he had and moved to the tabernacle? What of him? God said that he would have equal portions to eat besides what would come from the sale of whatever he owned. In other words, God would take care of him too. This is a lesson for us as well. Elders and preachers, those who labor for the gospel, have a right to live by the gospel, meaning supported in their work. Now, yes, they can work secularly in order not to burden the church that they labor among, but brethren must not think that elders and preachers shouldn't be supported for their work, for God always provided for his ministers through the giving of those whom his ministers worked among. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 9 to 14, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.